Welcome to The Debate. Today, we're diving deep into a concept that profoundly shapes our inner lives and our external contributions: solitude. Our focus is the source material, the wisdom and power of solitude, which draws a really, meticulous distinction between chosen, healthy solitude and mere isolation. It presents solitude as a vital practice for both cognitive and, personal development. The central question we're going to grapple with is this: does intelligent solitude unequivocally represent psychological strength and consistently lead to deeper societal contributions? Or are there inherent challenges and potential pitfalls in its cultivation that demand a far more cautious and, let's say, nuanced perspective? I'll be arguing that intelligent solitude is a critical, empowering path to unique insight and strength, transforming individuals and through them society.
While certainly acknowledging the profound benefits of introspection, will contend that the path to truly intelligent solitude is actually fraught with complexities and potential unintended consequences that really need a much closer look.
Excellent. So let's explore this. The source material makes a compelling case that intelligent solitude isn't just about being alone. It's a deliberate, powerful practice absolutely essential for human flourishing and meaningful contribution. It frames it as a conscious act of protecting intelligence and energy from constant social demands. Think about that for a moment. It's about creating space to truly be oneself. Schopenhauer, as quoted in the text, put it perfectly, didn't he? A man can be himself only so long as he is alone, and if he does not love solitude, he will not love freedom. This chosen withdrawal, the material explains, actually activates what researchers call the brain's default mode network.
Okay, can you elaborate on that a bit for our listeners? What exactly is the default mode network, and why is its activation significant here?
Absolutely. The default mode network is essentially the brain's idle mode, right? It's active when we're not focused on external tasks, allowing our minds to wander, to connect seemingly disparate ideas, and importantly, to engage in self-reflection. When this network is engaged through solitude, it fosters what the material calls cognitive silence. Those, rare moments free from external demands where, crucially, our deepest insights and breakthroughs occur. This practice leads to an inner richness and, significantly, cognitive self-sufficiency.
And cognitive self-sufficiency. Yet what does that mean in this context?
Good question. It's the ability to find fulfillment and stimulation from within, rather than constantly relying on external entertainment or social validation. Individuals embracing intelligent solitude, according to the text, manage their attention economics strategically. They choose depth over breadth in connections and foster divergent thinking, which is crucial for genuine creativity. Think of historical innovators like Einstein and Darwin. This entire approach, as the material suggests, signals profound psychological strength and prepares individuals to contribute to society from a place of deeper wisdom, clarity, and authenticity.
Okay, I can certainly appreciate the aspirational vision presented there. I mean, who wouldn't want deeper wisdom and authentic contribution? However, my perspective is that while there are clear potential benefits of introspection and focused thought that solitude offers, the journey to intelligent solitude is far more complex and, frankly, fraught with potential challenges than the material might initially lead us to believe. My primary concern lies with the very distinction the material makes between restorative solitude and avoidant isolation. While conceptually clear in the text, in practical terms, I find that line incredibly fine and easily blurred, even for individuals with the very best intentions.
So you're questioning the practicality of that distinction then? Because the material outlines it quite clearly, I thought. Restorative solitude is chosen from strength, used to recharge and generate insights, whereas avoidant isolation stems from fear or weakness, avoiding social contact due to anxiety or insecurity. This isn't just some theoretical point. It's presented as a practical framework for achieving what it calls balanced integration of reflection and meaningful engagement. The crucial element, as I mentioned, is conscious choice, agency, and an internal strength. One is proactive, the other reactive.
I agree, the concept of restorative versus avoidant is clear on paper, absolutely. But practically, how easy is it really to maintain that distinction day to day? Doesn't the very act of deliberately stepping back from constant social demands, even with the best intentions, put you at risk of blurring that line over time? The material presents this balanced integration as an achievement, something you reach, but the journey to maintain that precise balance without inadvertently slipping towards a more avoidant state, well, it can be arduous and perhaps even imperceptible to the individual at times. For instance, the very traits that might lead one to seek solitude, like a strong resistance to conformity or valuing intellectual honesty over social ease, those very traits could, if unchecked, suddenly push one further away from genuine engagement, making a return to that balanced integration more difficult than expected. Our internal assessment of our own strength or fear, it can be highly subjective, can't it?
I see your concern about that potential slippery slope, as you put it. But the text emphasizes that intelligent solitude isn't about perpetual withdrawal. It's about a conscious cycle. You retreat to recharge. You don't retreat because you're afraid. That conscious choice is really a hallmark of psychological strength. It's about taking control of your mental environment, not being a victim of social anxiety or pressure. The material is very clear that this is a choice from strength, not from weakness.
But human psychology is rarely so binary, is it? Our motivations can be quite mixed. What starts as a conscious choice from strength might subtly shift if the external social environment becomes too challenging, maybe too unrewarding, or simply if the individual finds that deeper engagement requires skills they haven't maybe practiced or honed while in isolation. It's not always like flipping a switch. It's more of a continuum, I think. And the longer one leans into the self-sufficiency aspect, the harder it might become to re-engage authentically, even if that was the original plan. It seems to place a significant burden on the individual for constant self-monitoring, which itself takes energy.
That's a fair point about the complexities of motivation, and it leads us directly to our next core point, actually, the optimal balance between solitude and social interaction for cognitive enhancement and creativity. The text highlights repeatedly that cognitive silence, moments free from external demands, is where the deepest insights and breakthroughs occur. It makes a strong case for divergent thinking, the ability to generate many novel ideas, as something uniquely facilitated by solitude. This is explicitly contrasted with convergent thinking, which seeks consensus in groups and, in doing so, the material argues, often suppresses originality.
So are you suggesting social interaction is always a drain on creativity then? Is that the implication?
Not always a drain, perhaps, but the text certainly makes the case that for truly profound, groundbreaking insights, there's a unique and maybe irreplaceable role for solitude. It points to the incubation principle, demonstrating that creative solutions often surface only when the unconscious mind has space to process ideas in silence, free from that immediate social cognitive load. It cites historical figures like Nikola Tesla and Virginia Woolf as prime examples of individuals who relied heavily on protected solitude for their creative breakthroughs. This implies that solitude isn't just one way to foster creativity, it's uniquely essential for those deep, original leaps that reshape fields.
I find that argument compelling on the surface, I do, but it seems to overlook the vital role of diverse perspectives that only social interaction can provide. While I grant the importance of quiet reflection for certain types of insights, I think it's important not to overstate the case or portray social interaction as solely a drain. Social interactions, when they're meaningful, beyond superficial small talk, can be an incredibly vital source of diverse perspectives, constructive challenge, and even external validation that helps refine nascent ideas. Collaborative environments, while certainly susceptible to convergent thinking, as you rightly pointed out, can also foster a kind of synergistic creativity that just might not emerge in isolation. The material states that every social interaction consumes finite mental energy, which, okay, that's true to an extent, but it doesn't adequately explore how positive, stimulating social interactions can also be restorative or energizing in their own way, offering a different kind of recharge and leading to equally valuable breakthroughs through dynamic dialogue, debate, and shared experience. Think of scientific breakthroughs made in bustling laboratories or artistic movements born from shared intellectual ferment. I mean, the Bloomsbury Group, which included Woolf, was a highly social intellectual circle, wasn't it?
That's an interesting counterpoint about Bloomsbury, but I'm not entirely convinced that it addresses the core distinction the material is trying to make. While I agree that positive social interactions can certainly be energizing and refining, the type of cognitive work described for those deepest insights specifically seems to require that cognitive silence. The source explicitly notes social cognitive load as a constant drain, referring to the mental effort of processing social cues, maintaining conversations, managing impressions, all that. The breakthroughs of an Einstein or a Newton, they weren't born from groupthink, were they? Nor were Darwin's original insights into natural selection. They seem to have come from intense, protected solitude, where divergent thinking could truly flourish without the pressure of immediate judgment or the need for consensus. Collaborative environments may refine ideas, sure, or combine existing ones. But the initial, truly novel spark, the profound insight, that often requires that internal, solitary processing the material champions. Are you suggesting that truly revolutionary ideas are just as likely to emerge from a committee meeting as from a quiet, reflective space?
Not from a committee meeting, perhaps, no. But from robust intellectual exchange, absolutely. And the incubation principle you mentioned, while crucial, doesn't necessarily dictate total isolation for its entire duration. It speaks to the unconscious mind processing information. And that processing can be profoundly sparked and enriched by an earlier, challenging conversation, maybe a new perspective gleaned from a colleague, or even a question posed by an outsider that forces a reevaluation of core assumptions. The material emphasizes the terrifying power of solitary intelligence. Okay, but that power is often amplified, isn't it, when it's honed against the insights of others? To what extent do truly revolutionary ideas emerge completely in a vacuum? Even the great minds you cited engage deeply with the existing body of knowledge and often with their peers, even if their most profound synthesis happened later in solitude.
That's a fair point. No knowledge truly exists in a vacuum, I'll grant you that. But the synthesis and the leap, those are often solitary acts. And this brings us nicely to our third point, the interplay between self-sufficiency and independence when it comes to contributing back to society. The material posits that solitary individuals develop cognitive self-sufficiency, meaning, essentially, they don't depend on external entertainment or validation to feel fulfilled. This inner richness and the outsider's perspective they gain by stepping back enable them to see patterns others might miss, leading to metacognitive awareness and intellectual honesty over, perhaps, social ease. They engage with society, the argument goes, from a place of fullness, strength, and choice, ultimately making deeper wisdom, clarity, and authenticity their main contribution. It's about a more potent, independent form of societal engagement, where contributions aren't driven by a need for approval, but by genuine insight.
I appreciate that ideal. Contributions driven by insight, not need. It's very appealing. However, I come at it from a slightly different angle. While cognitive self-sufficiency is presented as a clear strength, an overemphasis on not needing external entertainment or validation could, paradoxically perhaps, reduce the impetus for genuine, constructive engagement with the collective. An outsider's perspective, while undeniably insightful and often vital for challenging the status quo, requires effective channels and, frankly, a willingness to translate these insights into actionable forms that society can actually understand and adopt. If one becomes too independent of external validation, or maybe too distant from collective thought patterns, their capacity to influence or contribute meaningfully might diminish, regardless of the depth of their internal wisdom. True societal contribution often requires a delicate balance, doesn't it? A balance of individual insight with a capacity for collaborative action, negotiation, and that empathetic understanding of diverse viewpoints, which is largely cultivated, I'd argue, through sustained social interaction.
But the text is quite clear that solitary individuals focus on authentic, deep relationships and engage from a place of fullness, strength, and choice, which actually enhances rather than diminishes their social contributions. This isn't about disengagement. It's about engaging from a place of genuine internal resource, not neediness or dependency. Their freedom of thought and clarity of perspective gained in solitude allows them to challenge collective assumptions, making their contributions more valuable precisely because they are not swayed by the need for social approval or the desire to simply fit in. They bring a unique, often unfiltered truth.
I'm still not entirely convinced that's the whole picture, though. There's a significant difference between not being swayed by social approval and potentially struggling to effectively communicate or integrate one's insights into a collective context that, at some point, requires shared understanding, maybe compromise, and certainly collective action. The material itself talks about the terrifying power of solitary intelligence precisely because it unsettles those reliant on social approval. Okay, fine, but this very characteristic, while powerful for challenging norms, could inadvertently create a barrier to adoption or collective action if the solitary individual struggles to bridge that communication gap or perhaps to empathize with the existing social dynamics they're trying to influence. The material champions the wisdom gained, but it doesn't fully detail how this translation of solitary wisdom into practical societal action actually occurs, or the necessary social and communication skills required to achieve that impact. What good is profound insight if it cannot be effectively shared or integrated into the fabric of society?
It seems we fundamentally disagree on the practical implications of this self-sufficiency, perhaps. Ultimately, though, the material makes what I find to be a compelling case that intelligent solitude, when cultivated mindfully and from a place of strength, is far from a weakness or a path to isolation. It is a powerful tool for developing profound inner richness, achieving that crucial cognitive silence for creative breakthroughs, and fostering a unique freedom of thought. This empowers individuals to contribute their deeper wisdom, clarity, and authenticity to a world that, let's face it, profoundly needs clear thinkers, creators, and visionaries. The emphasis on balanced integration really underscores that this isn't about rejecting humanity, but rather preparing to engage with it more deeply and effectively from a place of true internal strength.
And while the aspirational aspects of intelligent solitude are undoubtedly clear and, yes, desirable, the complexities of human nature and the very real societal pressures that shape our choices suggest a more nuanced reality to me. The ease with which restorative solitude can subtly, almost imperceptibly, morph into a less healthy form of isolation, the potential for an over-reliance on self-sufficiency to inadvertently eclipse collaborative innovation, and the practical challenges, which I still see, of translating profound solitary insight into genuinely effective societal contribution. These all warrant a more cautious and critically engaged perspective. It's crucial, I believe, to acknowledge that equally powerful benefits for cognitive function and social impact emerge from vibrant, authentic human connection and rich dialogue, a dimension that perhaps merits deeper exploration within the material itself, alongside the undeniable virtues of solitude.
Both perspectives certainly highlight the profound significance of how individuals choose to engage with the world and indeed with themselves.
Absolutely. There is clearly much more to unpack within the material regarding the intricate and often delicate relationship between solitude, connection, and ultimately human flourishing.